Hello class. For this week's exercise, I want to finish up your unit on drawing spaces and environments by showing you how to draw objects shrinking in space in linear perspective. Another way to explain this is dividing space using linear perspective. So the example that I'll give is, let's say telephone poles. You could use this process of linear perspective to communicate a row of telephone poles equally spaced disappearing into the distance. You could use this linear perspective to show exactly how much the distance between the poles will shrink and how much the poles will shrink in space. So let me just show you that, and I'll just draw telephone poles for this one. So as with other forms of linear perspective, you will need to draw a horizon line and a vanishing point. So here, you should use a sheet of newsprint to do this, and give yourself a fair bit of space, maybe around the size of a piece of printer paper. And so the next step after you give yourself a horizon line is to give yourself a vanishing point. This is where my telephone poles will be disappearing off into space, and so I placed it over on the far right. And I'll show you also that you can set a vanishing point 2 here. And anything that's going the other direction, say the top of my telephone poles, can be aimed at vanishing point 2. But for this exercise, it's up to you if you want to do the telephone poles or just map objects with the one vanishing point. So the next step after you have your vanishing points is to draw the first telephone pole. And so I am going to place it here. And you're going to need to calculate the midpoint of your pole. And so make sure you draw this against a ruler. Anytime you have perfectly straight lines, you should use a ruler. And I'm actually going to make sure that this telephone pole is 4 inches, and I've marked the 2-inch mark. Oops. Let's calculate that a bit. The 2-inch mark is here. So here's my telephone pole, and I've marked the midpoint. The next step is to aim from the midpoint of your telephone pole to vanishing point 1. And this line will be erased, so make sure to use light pressure. And next, I'm actually going to do the top of my telephone pole in linear perspective by drawing the crossbar towards vanishing point 2. And the closer your forms are to the vanishing points, the more distorted and foreshortened they get. So you can see, because vanishing point 2 is very close, this is a very severe angle that the other portion of the pole is aimed towards. All right, so next what you are going to do is you're going to draw a line from the top of your first pole through your second pole. And so this calculation in linear perspective requires you to set up what the initial distance is between the first 2 poles. And so I'm going to draw the next pole, and to do that, I'm going to draw a faint line from the top of my telephone pole to vanishing point 1, and that line should be the boundary for the height of my next poles. So I'm going to place telephone pole 2 here, and it's hitting that top line. And then in order to calculate where telephone pole 3 should be, if these are equally spaced, you go from the top of telephone pole 1 through the midpoint of telephone pole 2, and where this line hits is where telephone pole 3 is going to go. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So let me show you with the next set of poles. So we're going to go from the top of telephone pole 2 through the midpoint of telephone pole 3. And that tells us where the telephone pole 4 should be. And then we can do the same thing from 3 through the middle of 4. Remember to use light pressure for lines that aren't going to be in the actual drawing, because the second half of this exercise is to use your imagination to complete the drawing and turn this linear perspective exercise into an actual space. So I'll just do a couple more from the top of this pole through the middle of the next, down to that bottom. And this will be my last one. One thing to take note of is that how much smaller the pole is than the first one, and then how much shorter the spaces get. So note. And now I can actually map out the crossbars, and to do that I'm actually going to mark where I put the first crossbar, aiming that to vanishing point 1 to keep that consistent, because if not I would just be placing these crossbars at different heights. I think I actually can also map out where the ends of my crossbar should stay within as well. One thing to note too is my first pole could have gone below the horizon line. It didn't need to be directly on it. That you get in the same way that the pole's height is limited by the height of the first pole, the pole's bottom length is going to be limited by the bottom of the pole too. So if this extended out below the horizon line, the other poles would actually be ending down here with the same horizon line and the same vanishing point. It gives a different sense of the space because now there's a believable linear perspective both at the top and bottom of the pole. In the initial drawing, where the bottom was the horizon line, it's just a straight line, so there's less of an illusion of perspective. Alright, so now I can calculate my crossbars. So I'm staying within the boundaries of these bars, crossbars. By the time we get to these really far away ones, it's harder to see. And so that is how you divide space, regularly spaced objects in linear perspective. So for the rest of your drawing time for this exercise, I want you to take the exercise, and I want you to use this exercise as an experiment to see what the limits are of your imagination. So I want you to actually try to give as much believable space to this drawing after you've mapped out the linear perspective, and just see how much believable detail are you capable of rendering just with imagination, how much believable space. You can set a boundary to the drawing that could be useful. And I want you to be deploying values and shading. Remember, you can use the side of the pencil to lay down shade quicker. I'm going to leave this horizon line actually and let it be the actual horizon line of the piece. Something I could do also is I could actually put a road in linear perspective since we have a vanishing point here. So when you're done mapping it out, just move to shading. And one thing that I want you to consider is where is going to be the light source. The easiest light sources to keep track of are light coming from above, light coming from the right, light coming from the left. And so if I were to shade all these poles, let's have the light coming from the left. So I can add shadow. And for now, I've been relaxing the size requirement of drawings, but don't make the scale of these drawings so small that you suffer for it, that it becomes too difficult to get detail in. There's going to be a sweet spot where the drawing is the right size for you to finish and develop and refine the drawing without being limited by the small scale. So just keep experimenting for what that is. And depending on the subject matter, the scale requirement will be different. Another thing to think about is cast shadows or shadows that is a really great way to begin to communicate believable space. And I'm actually going to aim my cast shadows at vanishing point 2 just to keep them consistent. Roughly. And you can populate the drawing with characters or other things happening. I'll put a hot air balloon in. But just remember that whatever you draw, you want to try to make it as convincing as possible. So that's why I picked a form like a hot air balloon. I'm fairly confident that with enough time I could use my imagination to get it pretty rendered. So this second part of the exercise is really about testing out the limitations of your imagination. So in my own studio practice, I oscillate between working exclusively from photo references, then I'll get really sick of that and I will work from imagination for a few paintings, then I'll get sick of that and I'll work from life for a few paintings and then back to photographs. So what's good news is that the more life drawing you do and just the more drawing in general, and the more direct, careful, mindful observing you do in general, the greater your capacity for drawing from the imagination becomes. So if you put in a lot of practice, your skill at being able to draw from the imagination will really evolve. That's important to you. One thing to keep in mind for all drawings is to limit the white of the page. And so for these drawings and shading, in order to get the feeling of a completed drawing, you really do have to become very selective about how much of the white of the page you leave. And so I assume you guys will be using graphite for this, so just remember that using the side of the pencil will help you deploy material. Another thing that I've been noticing from drawings is that lately is that some of you still aren't blending material, so make sure that you're not just leaving the default texture of your charcoal or graphite. And I didn't erase some of the guidelines from the linear perspective because I'm going to do a bit of blending. I'm going to try using a Q-tip to blend. Those of you that are still struggling with rendering detail should be using the blending stumps or make your own blending stump, and a Q-tip works pretty similarly to a blending stump as well. But there's a certain level of detail that's just not possible without using tools to assist with that detail. Mechanical erasers, blending stumps. So even when you're working with graphite, sometimes it's a good idea to set a ground down so that way you can have the ability to erase up lighter values. With this unit and the figure, about the figure, you can explore placing figures or objects at different spaces within this composition. That how you ground a figure into an environment is a really important aspect of figurative art. So we've got the little guy in the hot air balloon, and then maybe I'll put someone in the extreme foreground. And in order to start giving the drawing different areas of value, I'll darken this figure, shadow. Subjects closer to the viewer are going to have the most detail and the most contrast in general. So now I'm breaking up the composition a little bit by adding something in the foreground. I used to get pretty bored with exercises when I was in school, so I understand if you feel that way, and that's why I give you guys the freedom to make drawings that mean something to you or are entertaining to you. So that's why I'm doing this right now, to keep it entertaining for me. All right, have fun, guys.